Perfect. Welcome, everybody, to our session today on human learning systems, the role of national government in systems innovation. So, depending on where you're joining us from, if this is your first Systems Innovation London Hub event, welcome. And if you're back again, welcome back. So, I'm going to keep the introduction very short as we've got a lot of content to cover. But we're really excited to host this conversation today because human learning systems is a complexity-inspired approach to public services. It's an alternative approach to public management, which embraces the complexity of the real world and enables us to work effectively in that complexity. So I suspect, especially over the last year, many of us have become increasingly familiar with just how complex work in the public sphere is. And at least speaking from my personal experience, I think the word complexity is used quite a lot, but it's often difficult to translate even an understanding of complexity at a theoretical or conceptual level into practice. So we are really fortunate to have three speakers here with us today. First, we've got Toby Lowe, who is the visiting professor of public management at the Center for Public Impact. And he is one of the core contributors to human learning systems, which is this alternative approach to working in the public sector. And we also have Anneli and Paula joining us from the Innovation Center of the Finnish National Agency for Education. Paula, thanks for the wave. And so the way that today is going to be set up is Toby is really going to open with an introduction to human learning systems, more from a theoretical or methodological side of things. And then Paula and Anneli are going to share firsthand experience and something of a case study of putting human learning systems to work. So we really get the advantage of theory and concepts and putting it into practice. I'm joined by a host, John Mortimer, who has done a lot of work in the public space, is the founder of Impro Consulting, and he and I will be popping back towards the end of the session to field questions. So on that, we invite you to post any questions you have in the chat through the presentations. John and I will field some of those towards the end. And then for any of you who want to stick around for a few minutes after the hour, we'll be continuing the Q&A session then. Just a reminder that this session is being live streamed and recorded. And with that, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Toby Lowe.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Right, so let's start slides. So if someone could give me a thumbs up if they can see my slides, brilliant. So thank you very much for coming and talking with us this afternoon, folks. So my name is Toby Lowe. As Mark was saying, I'm visiting professor of public management at the Centre for Public Impact. And what I'm going to cover today is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about complexity and public service outcomes. And I'm going to highlight the nature of the public management problem that we have when we recognise the complexity of public service outcomes. I'm going to briefly run us through an alternative framework for doing public management, human learning systems, and then you're going to hear from Anneli and Paula to look at an example of this in practice. So let's kick off with the question, how are outcomes made? Because there's now kind of pretty decent consensus that the purpose of public service is to help create good outcomes in the world. And another way of saying that is we think that the purpose of public service is to support human freedom and flourishing. And so that when we translate human freedom and flourishing into kind of public management speak, we get this language of helping people create positive outcomes in their lives. So if we say that is the purpose of public service, to help create positive outcomes in people's lives, how is complexity relevant to public management? We think that complexity is relevant because it is essentially four aspects of complexity that describe how outcomes are made. So essentially, if we want to understand the processes by which outcomes are made in the world, we need to understand how those processes are created by complex systems. So we think there's 4 different aspects to complexity which help explain and understand how outcomes are made. Firstly, compositional complexity, so the way that outcomes are created by many different factors interacting together. Secondly, dynamic complexity, the way that the factors produce outcomes interact in ever-changing ways. Experiential complexity, the way that the factors which produce an outcome and the experience of that outcome is different for each person. And finally, governance complexity, in that the systems which produce outcomes are beyond the control of any of the actors. And I'll dig into each of those ideas in more depth now. So let's take the idea of compositional complexity for starters. So this is a representation of the idea that any outcome in the world is the product of hundreds of different factors working together. And so we can, one of the best illustrations of this is the obesity systems map produced by the UK government in 2007. They basically shut a bunch of public health people in a room and said, you're not allowed out until you've mapped all the factors that lead to the outcome of obesity or its absence and the relationships between all of those factors. So they produced a kind of a classic causal loop diagram as a systems map. And what you can see, the individual factors are too small on this diagram. There were 108 of them they produced, but you can see them summed up into areas like macroeconomic drivers, education, media, technology, the nature of work, built environment, early life experiences, healthcare and treatment options. You see the range of factors interacting together that create the outcome. So any outcome in the world is the product of interaction of a complex system functioning like this. And the second aspect of complexity is this idea of experiential complexity. So this compositional complexity highlights at a kind of population level the hundreds of different factors interacting to produce an outcome. We now understand. Now we can understand that each one of us has our own unique systems map for how an outcome is created. So what obesity means in my life and the factors, the actors and factors that are responsible for creating it are different for yours. So let's take the example of well-being. What well-being means in my life will be different from what well-being means for you. So we each have our own unique systems map for each outcome. And thirdly, one of the problems of these representations of causal loop diagrams in this way is that they present a systems map as a static thing. Actually, in the world, a complex system is a dynamic thing. So the way that the factors are interacting with each other is always changing. And finally, we can identify governance complexity. That all of those, if we look at all of those different factors, there is no one actor in the system that has control of all of those factors. So we use governance complexity to identify that the systems that produce outcomes are beyond the control of any of the actors. So that is the way that complexity frames the production of outcomes, public service outcomes in the world. And this gives us a public management problem. And so just to make sure that we're all on the same page with the terminology, by public management, I mean the practice of how public services are planned and organized. And what we can see is that the current dominant paradigm for public management fails in complex environments. And so the current public management paradigm has a name. It's called New Public Management. It was created in the kind of 1980s, and it's often described as the 3 M's: markets, managers, and metrics. I won't dig into that now, but I'm sure you'll recognise from that the various different aspects of the dominant way of doing public management right now. The only trouble is that the dominant way of doing public management right now just doesn't work. Like that, it fails in complex environments, and you can see that failure show up in all the research about the environment. So the top quote here is from a study by Christopher Hood, probably one of the most preeminent public management scholars in the world. He did a study looking across 3 decades of new public management reforms and to see whether they met its claims or not. does it create a government that works better and costs less? No. The short answer seems to be higher costs and more complaints. And when you dig into the evidence about some of the key practices underpinning public management, like target-based performance management, you see exactly why it fails in this way. So, for example, systematic review of effective target-based performance management, 80% of studies find evidence of gaming, so deliberate manipulation of data, and 3/4 of the studies find evidence of people deliberately lying. So what we can see is the evidence shows that new public management fails. And our analysis of this suggests that what new public management does is it creates a simplified fantasy world in which the abstractions of data points substitute for the complex reality of life. Because people are using performance data that's routinely gained, so isn't really worth anything, learning or decision making. People are writing plans that they know won't happen. They're creating budgets that they know don't reflect the reality of the work. And worst of all, it treats the people we serve as data points, not as full human beings. And so what we find is that complexity breaks new public management. So it is dependent on a set of linear relationships where if we do A, then B will reliably happen. And that as public managers, we are taught to kind of be, this is the foundation of our thinking, this kind of linear A to B relationship. But as soon as we open the door to the complex reality of the everyday world, we find that those linear relationships break. So what that says is that if we want to create genuine outcomes in the complex reality of the world, we need to do public management differently. And this is the work that we've been doing around creating an alternative approach, which we have latterly come to call human learning system. So we, in June this year, we released a new free ebook outlining what that approach looks like with 48 case studies as the kind of research foundation of this. So in essence, we know what an alternative approach to public management looks like because we've seen these people. And you're going to hear from one of the case studies from Finland after I've been speaking. So what we've found is that these organisations, from local voluntary sector organisations through to national governments, have found an alternative way of working. And it's important to say that our knowledge around this is incomplete because it is a public management paradigm that is still being shaped by the people doing it. And there is still so much to learn about the different aspects of it, because essentially it looks different in every new context in which it's tried. So now I'm going to give you just the headlines of the key aspects of the human learning systems approach to public management slide. So starting with the idea of human. This speaks to the fundamental beliefs of public service. So, as I was saying at the start, the fundamental belief that the purpose of public service is to promote human freedom and flourishing. And that has a consequence in that if we believe that public service is to promote human freedom and flourishing, it has a consequence in terms of how we understand outcomes. Because it means that if you're trying to create flourishing in my life and you respect my freedom, then only I have the right to determine what a good outcome looks like in my life. No one else but me has the right to say what a good outcome looks like in my life. I mean, obviously there are issues with capacity in some circumstances and children, but the general point holds. And secondly, second fundamental belief is that to understand a human being is to see them in the complex web of relationships that is their lives. So this is a radically interdependent view of human beings. And what the consequence of that belief is that it recognizes the point we saw earlier of compositional complexity, that outcomes are created by all the actors and factors in my life. So the way that the human learning systems perspective represents the way an outcome is made is to say a person is at the center of their own life as system, and it is their life as a complex system that produces an outcome. The pattern of results in that person's life is just what we call an outcome. And so we can represent the actors and factors that lead to the production of that outcome in each person's life. So we can represent the actors in the person's life, so the people and organizations that help create an outcome, by representing the person themselves at the center of their life as system. And then think about all the other actors, the people and organizations that are responsible, that have shared responsibility for that outcome in their life. So their family and friends. If we're looking at the outcome of well-being, then people who provide green spaces near them, their neighbourhood associations, their welfare and benefits agencies, the local authority, blah, 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 blah. And down the right, if we look at the factors that influence well-being in someone's life, then you can begin to see how these actors and factors interact in each person's life as a complex. But the human element is essentially saying that public service starts from the reality of the complex life of each and every person. And then that public service needs to respond to that unique complex system that produces outcomes in each person's life by building a relationship with them, and so that they understand that unique system that is each person's life, and provides a bespoke response to meet the unique understanding, the experiential complexity of that person's life, and the compositional and dynamic complexity of the way an outcome is created in each person. Then, moving on to the learning aspect, what we've found is, in order to enact that relational, bespoke way of working, learning becomes the management strategy. So at all levels, what public managers are trying to do is to create learning environments, and they're using learning as a management strategy. So let me illustrate what I mean by that. So let's say that I'm a public service worker trying to support a person who's in chronic pain. And chronic pain is a kind of an outcome in someone's life where there is no corresponding physical injury to fix. So if I'm trying to support a person in chronic pain to alleviate that pain, that process, that what I do as a worker is enact this learning cycle where I'm building a learning relationship with the person that I'm serving. So the first aspect of this is understanding their unique life as a complex system, which apparently produces the outcome of chronic pain. So I might ask them, for example, do you experience the pain more in the mornings or the evenings? Do you experience the pain more at work or at home? Do you experience it when you do this particular action or that particular action? When you eat these foods or not? And together we build up a picture of their life as a system that is currently producing the outcome of chronic pain. Then we enter into a co-design phase, where what we do is design experiments, interventions in that person's life to see whether we can get that life to produce a different result, a different outcome. So we might say, what happens if we try this set of physiotherapy manipulations? What happens if you join this walking group? What happens if you try this set of exercises or that set of exercises? What happens if you try this diet rather than that? And we then run each of those experiments and explorations together. We find what works and what doesn't, and we embed the results of those experiments as both behavioural changes and structural changes in that person's life. And in doing so, we change that person's life as system, so we go round and around and around again. And so it frames the idea of public service as a learning relationship between the public service worker and the person being served. And this is how we create the idea of bespoke public service. So it is by running these learning cycles, by this being the strategy for each and every public service worker, we create the kind of bespoke public service that a human approach that recognises human freedom and flourishing demands. So human learning systems. What's the systems aspect of this? Well, just to make sure we're all on the same page with language again, in a human learning systems context, a system is just a way of describing a set of relationships in the world that combine to make something happen. And so when we talk about systems in the human learning systems approach, we mean a set of relationships which create a desired outcome or its absence. So when we're framing the idea of a system in human learning systems, we mean all of those actors and all of those factors that combine to create an outcome. And so what we've seen is that if that's our framing for systems, then the systems operate simultaneously at multiple different scales. So we've seen people thinking about systems at the person-to-person level, so at the level of relationship between a public service worker and the personal people they support, at the level of organisation, at the level of place, and a level of country or region. And what we've seen at each of these system scales is that people are running this kind of learning cycle. So no matter what scale they're operating at, whether it's person, organisation, pleasure, what people are doing is running this kind of learning cycle. So I've talked you through what that looks like at the person as system scale. But what that means at a, say, an organisational scale is that we create a connected pair of learning cycles from the person as system scale to the organisational scale, where the purpose of the larger scale is to learn from the person scale, the scale below, and to enable the scale below. So you're creating connected learning cycles where the purpose of the learning cycle at the larger scale is to learn from and enable all the different learning cycles at the scale below. Let me illustrate a bit more of what I mean by that. So at an organisational scale, the organisation might ask, how do we learn from all of the learning cycles at the person scale? So what patterns do we see from across all those person's life systems? So what policies do we need to change to enable change for people? So if I'm, for example, a housing organisation and a bunch of the people that we house are in chronic pain, what are the policies that we need to change from learning from all of those individual learning cycles? Is there something we need to change about the way that we provide equipment? Is there something that we need to change about who gets what type of house? What are the patterns from all of those different learning cycles? And secondly, we have a bunch of questions as managers about how we enable those learning cycles to run at the person scale. So, for example, what are the maximum caseloads that workers can handle in order to have those learning relationships and have them well? What information systems do we need to share knowledge across those different workers and across those different learning cycles? What shared reflective practices do we create, spaces do we create in order to enable our staff to learn together? What's the capabilities of staff that we need to recruit and train for in order to enable those learning cycles? And so those become the experiments that are being run at the organisation as system scale. So that's the content of the learning cycle that happens at that scale. And you can see how then each pair of learning systems is connected in that learn from and enable way. And what we found then is that the human learning systems as an overall public management strategy is to create these learning cycles, connected learning cycles at each and every system scale. And so where the place, at the learning cycle, the place level is asking questions like, okay, how do we enable learning cycles to happen at each of the organisations? How do we need to commission in order to enable learning across all the different organisations? And at the country scale, similarly, they're asking, how do we enable learning cycles to happen at the place scale? How do we enable learning across different places? How do we fund places so that they are able to learn? And those become the experiments that are happening, the learning cycles that are happening at these scales. So overall, it's a public management strategy trying to create connected learning cycles right from the grassroots upwards through the regional or national. And so we call the task of managing and governing the learning cycles and the relationships between them system stewardship. So in a human learning systems approach, system stewardship is the primary leadership task. So the purpose of system stewards is to manage and govern these learning cycles to ensure that they are healthy systems. So that's a bit of a dash through the human learning systems approach, and it's why we think that this is a public management approach for the real world, because it starts with the reality of how outcomes are made. And in order to do that, people adopt learning as the management strategy. So as a leader, your primary task is to create learning environments. And this strategy can be applied to all system scales, person to organisation, to place, to country and region. Now, that is a significant amount of work and really, really significant change work. I don't think any of the case studies involved in this would pretend that that is easy work at all. But the payoff for doing all of that change work is what people have found is better outcomes for less money, and really, really significantly happier people. So happier citizens who are getting the public service that is right for them, and happier staff because they are liberated to do the jobs they came into public. So you've heard me outline some of the kind of conceptual framework around this. Now we can hear an example of what that looks like when enacted at the national government level. I'm going to hand you over to Paula and to Annalie, who can talk about what the role of national government is in enabling and learning from learning cycles at the local level.
Thank you, Toby. Hi, everyone. I'm Paula Tyrväinen. Greetings from sunny Finland. Annalie Rautiainen is my colleague here with me. Could you turn on your camera so we can both be here? Okay, so I'll just get my presentation started and we can get on our way. And a thumbs up. You can see my presentation. Just a minute, I'll put it on a sharing mode. Okay, so I'll try to stick in my timeline, roughly 15 minutes, if I'm correct. I hope I'm right. Okay, so let's get started. We were kindly asked to share some of our insights on our learning journey as the first national level, government level innovation unit in the education sector in Finland. And I'll just show you the first slide, sorry. Yeah, and we wanted to, this is the title that we gave to our presentation. So we kind of want to share the insights of schools and education government exploring complexity together, using learning as a strategy to support and steer learning at the local level. I placed us here in the middle. If you can see, that's three kind of points of view for our job, which have been kind of the starting ground of our work. We work at the national level, supporting education sector with the tools and methods of co-creation, co-development and experimentation in order to help every child flourish and reach their potential at the local level. We've been working since 2017. Our first tenure was an experiment in itself, if you like, and now we are a permanent function or activity within the organization. I'll tell you a bit more what happens now, but now let's get back to where we started from. Just to understand the context, it's quite important. So I wanted to tell you a couple of things about the education system in Finland. We're really challenged by the traditional ways of working in the educational system and at schools, COVID-19 being a very good example on the rapid transition to turn to distance learning at scale as a good example of the complexity and the nature of the environment we're operating. And in order to understand my presentation, I'd like to tell you a couple of things about the system. Firstly, the Finnish formal education system is based on high level of autonomy in every level of the system, equity and trust. In practice, this means that all schools follow the national core curricula, which includes objectives and core contents of different subjects. However, the education providers, most often municipalities at local level education authorities and schools themselves, draw up their own curricula within the framework of the national core curriculum. And the national government also allows or allocates annually development funding for schools, mainly based on call for proposals. So high level of autonomy and trust on all levels. So when we kicked off our journey, we wanted to understand what are the wicked problems that schools face in their daily lives. We traveled around Finland, organized workshops and talked to a number of professionals at schools municipalities to discover the drivers for change. Most often, problems that we heard were complex by nature, related to well-being challenges and the chiasm of well-being and learning. Innovation was very often done in pockets. Schools needed to open up to society and to find new ways to engage students and stakeholders and learn by experimenting. We recognize the need for a more human-centered approach where the solutions are designed for the people, with the people in dialogue to promote trust at all levels. So we see these elements as drivers for change on system scale. We wanted to put these drivers in practice. So we actually organized 3 different experimentation labs or supported change programs, if you like, for teachers, principals, education leaders at local level. The first lab we launched with 12 teams from different regions in Finland, and our role was to build a local innovation capacity by mentoring, coaching, and peer learning, supporting the teams, carrying out experimentations on school level. The second lab was a kind of an iteration of the first version, integrated as part of a larger national development program with 8 teams from different regions in Finland, working as part of a larger networks projects. We focused on creating learning loops and more intensive dialogue between the national level public administration and practitioners at local level. So what we did was that we invited public servants to take part in the experimentations at local level, take part in discussions. And we noticed that it took a lot of support to discover the new role of being a learning partner instead of a monitor or supervisor of development work. Therefore, we wanted to launch a 3rd experimentation program with the focus on mentoring our colleagues at the National Agency for Education. It was an 8-month-long mentoring program with exploration to new roles and identity of national administration, steering and developing education in a learning partner role. We described it as a safe place for our colleagues to experiment in practice, taking baby steps by experimenting at small scale to reflect the transition and share thoughts with colleagues. Here you see the experimentation lab and the core elements that we used a little bit differently in each program, but those were always the core fundamentals. Peer learning between practitioners, mentoring and coaching by our team, more or less once a month, teams carrying out and evaluating experiments in practice with students and stakeholders. Most teams in municipalities stayed at the level of building capacity, learning to co-develop, but some managed to grow solutions and engage in local decision-making, also to evaluate the impact of the experimentations and even integrate the lessons learned into everyday life. The learning needs structures, and we wanted to pilot during our experimentation labs a method to help people discuss development work. And to support the collective efforts at local level, we needed a kind of a way, an evaluation criteria and a form to bring people together. So we piloted a new kind of a multi-perspective, human-centered evaluation approach, applying both new kind of multi-party dialogue methods and software tools to facilitate participatory evaluation. It was a kind of a joint effort where we developed this methodology together with 2 different research institutions in Finland, Technical Research Centre of Finland and Finnish Institute of Occupational Health. We also involved all the lab members, so teachers, principals from schools. So they were co-developing the methodology with us. It's rooted in theory based on service innovation and participatory evaluation, and it provided us criteria to reflect in a multi-perspective way of the experimentations done at the local level in schools. The core element which really supported the learning, the joint learning effort, was the assessment dialogues, which we call them. They are the core of the method, if you like. They were facilitated 2 to 3 hour workshops, which provided a space to reflect the development process and integrate lessons learned into everyday life. During this dialogue, students and parents took part as equals to education professionals, reflecting on the potential impact and change they observed in everyday life during the experimentations at local level. We also used the visualization diagrams as a starting point for the discussions at the reflection workshops. Basically, we wanted to show that even though we took part in the same experimentations, depending on your background and your point of view, you might observe the potential for impact in a different way. Here you see just some quotes, genuine quotes from some of the discussions that took place. Teachers and heads of schools might see the development work very differently when you think about the point of view of a student or even a mom. And I really like this comment: as a mom, I'm curious to take part in school development, but I don't always know what's going on. So bringing in the stakeholders inside the school really promoted and kind of speeded off the learning cycles, as Toby nicely described earlier. So to conclude some of the lessons that we've learned, I wanted to show you a kind of a map of tensions that we discovered during our journey in the education system. It's not enough to promote change in one particular level of the system. And I fully agree with Tony that you need to work on all the levels and promote the learning within the level of the system, but also between different levels of the system. Our very high ambition is to promote the system's change in the way we develop education and grow solutions. And these are some of the tensions that we need to pay attention to in order to grow the solutions in a durable and sustainable way. I highlighted the importance of changing role of governments and leadership from stability and control to networking and building bridges. We really learned that operating as a change makers within the government, it's sometimes easier to collaborate with practitioners in the field than within our own agency. Our presence and learning as a learning partner on local level was highly appreciated by teachers and leaders. Our approach seems to work quite well with complex problems when adapting and anticipating the future, where the role of the governance is to build bridges and strengthen the learning loops at national level. However, the dominant culture still focuses heavily on routine tasks and linear development processes and incremental innovation, which leave only little room for curiosity and discovery. So at the moment, we're actually trying to spot where we should stand, what's our identity, and where's the value added in the system. To conclude here some of our reflections quite quickly. I hope that you could follow the presentation, and we're here to answer your questions. At the moment, me and Anneli, we continue as a permanent function supporting both the governance and the municipalities and local level work. And we're taking very small steps to scale the learned lessons and applying our approach in different contexts and environments. And we feel that it's a very good momentum to build alliances and new connections with foresights and anticipation. There we actually see some very positive signals and sense enthusiasm in the air. And you have, if I understood correctly, you have our case study and the evaluation that was carried out from our first tenure. And in case you have any questions, we're happy to discuss them with you, and please feel free to contact us later as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paula and Toby and Anneli. So we are doing really well on time. So it's an opportunity for all of you to ask questions of our trio of speakers. So you can post those in the chat, and maybe as sort of a naive question to get us started. I'd be curious to hear, Toby, looking at the Human Learning Systems report, it's extremely comprehensive. It draws on a lot of different disciplines. Curious, how does anybody get started with something like human learning systems, and do they need to adopt everything, or can you start with bits and pieces?
So, I mean, what we've found is the the unit and method of change towards a kind of different public management approach is the experiment. So what we've seen people do is at all different scales, from a practitioner saying, actually, I'm going to change the way I practice and I'm going to build a learning relationship with those guys, through to team managers going, we're going to let's manage our team differently together. Let's make learning the way that we work together, through to a whole organization saying we're going to experiment with how learning as a strategy works across all organizations. It's essentially, so the way that we have seen people change, people and organizations change, is purposefully experimenting with doing public management differently. And you can do that at any scale. So there is some permission space that you can create for yourself for an experiment just in your own practice. The question is, how big a permission space for experimenting with doing this stuff differently can you create by connecting with others? Because, and this is the other kind of thing that we have found kind of quite dramatically across different case studies been involved with. If you're feeling dissatisfied with how kind of new public management frames your work, others will be too. And so what can you do to draw out that sense of dissonance, that sense of frustration with how things are being done right now, and create an alliance to do as big a permission space and experiment with doing things differently as you
can? I haven't heard it before, but I really like permission space as a concept. And that really resonates for me. So it's whether you're, I think what I heard was whether you're an individual leading a team, running an organization, or part of running a country, you can experiment within your permission space and apply some version of human learning systems. Brilliant. Thanks, Toby. All right, so we've got a question from Mariana, which is, Toby, how do you sell this to governments? What's worked for you in terms of hooks to get people interested?
I suppose there are a couple of different answers to this. So one of the things that we found across the case studies is that this enables the creation of genuine public service outcomes for less money. So there is a kind of really, on one hand, there's a really simple sell to governments that goes, do you want better outcomes for less money? And there's very few people, few senior leaders and few politicians that doesn't spark some kind of interest in it. But the truth in it, the truth, a kind of fundamental truth I've realised about this, when I first started on this kind of paradigm shift change process, I thought it was going to be a selling job, but actually it's not a selling job, because you can't. It's really, really hard to talk someone into paradigm shift, because what we're talking about here is paradigm shift in public management. And essentially the energy for paradigm shift comes from dissonance. Right? The energy required to do all the work that's required to make the kind of fundamental shift that we're talking about has to start with a powerful sense of dissatisfaction that the way we do things right now just doesn't work and can't be made. So my kind of thing about this is, don't try and sell the idea of human learning systems to people. Find the people that know it doesn't work and enable them to express that dissatisfaction. Ask them, does this human learning system stuff, does that help make sense of that feeling of dissonance and dissatisfaction that you've just told me about? If so, let's try something different, eh? Let's experiment.
Great. So Dora has a great question following up from the first one, which is, what if your permission space is minuscule? And maybe as an addition to that one, I'm curious if there are any case studies in the report that are sort of much smaller scope.
So there are kind of case studies of smaller voluntary sector organisations doing this. So, for example, one I would kind of point people at is the Moray Wellbeing Hub in Scotland, or kind of Surrey Youth Focus in England. These are organisations, small organisations, kind of neighbourhood based, that you wouldn't necessarily say have any formal power in the system, because they're reliant on funding from others. And yet they have been able to change their practices essentially by kind of founding it on that idea of a learning relationship between the person being served and the people serving. Because just about every worker has the permission space to say, okay, I'm going to relate to you differently. Let's form a learning relationship together. But also, I mean, I'm talking about this from looking at kind of case study evidence from across a whole different organizations. I'd be really curious to hear from Annalie and Paola about how the role that they have played in creating permission spaces, because I think that is a really significant kind of aspect of this.
Annalie, do you want to go? Or if I quickly start, I think that we had a lot of freedom to choose when we started off as an experiment ourselves within the government, that we had a lot of freedom to take direction. So we had all the permission that we didn't need to ask for it. But at this point, after the experimentation stage has finished, now we're in the situation where we have to build new alliances with and find those who are, as Toby well described, are already kind of have the buy-in for an alternative way of thinking. So we basically need to forget the ones who are not convinced and work our way with the ones who are, which will eventually probably become the maturity, but we're still a long way to go. But Annalie, do you want to reflect on your thinking?
There's a lot of trust in our system, and we're very fortunate that way. So there is control and there is hierarchical structures in place despite of that. So I feel that once you start dreaming big and acting small, once you're acting small within your own space, you don't really have to ask anyone. And then, but once you start, but you have to be interactive. You really have to communicate of what you're doing, because it's a very difficult concept to comprehend unless you're in the process yourself. So, you need to be open. It has to be transparent. It has to be open for anyone to enter at any point. So to create curiosity is the first thing. And then once they hear the stories, we felt that the power of stories is very big in working in a different way. There was a comment on the chat, what happens when leaders grow, but the organization doesn't. And what we've experienced is that we need more bottom-up approaches, where we start working at the grassroots level with the people who have the problems that they want to solve together. No one can say that it is wrong what kind of a phenomenon you're trying to solve together. So then we become less hierarchical and get little by little rid of the waterfall concept and implementation and scaling, what usually are the core responsibilities of governance. And you start working in a totally opposite way and bring the messages up to the governance, what's happening at the grassroots level.
Just a quick comment. I wanted to just add one more thing. That I really do believe it's so much easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. Once you're in the position that you have at least a little bit of freedom, just do it. And then you'll have the people joining your mission eventually. And I'm sure that, as Toby well explained, that when you're in the situation where there's just the old ways don't work, and you always have those, kind of reflecting on your work, then just quickly, grab those and ask them to join you. But don't ask for too much of a permission. That's my lesson that I learned.
So we might amend it to start describing it as a permission or as a forgiveness space rather than a permission space. Fair. So to tie back to another question in chat, and just to call out a theme that I think is emerging, but I'd be curious if the three of you agree. It almost sounds like there's an evolutionary dynamic taking place where a learning loop can start in a very small pocket where you're identifying dissonance that a group of people are feeling, and where that dissonance gives enough energy for willingness to experiment in ways that are probably safe. And at least the sense I got in my mind was that over time, that the permission or forgiveness space expanded or expands quite a bit as the experiments bear fruit, as it were. Is that a sort of somewhat accurate description of how these initiatives evolve, or would you describe it differently?
Do you want to go first, Paula? Emily?
Well, I just wanted to say that making system change is difficult. It's very difficult. And it doesn't happen at once. And especially in the field of education, we are practitioners and we want to solve issues quickly. And so you need to become very patient too, and believe that by doing small things, the system change will slowly take place. If we never begin, we'll never reach it. But once you have to be aware of what is the system like and who are the actors within each part of the system, and build interaction between the system divisions. Because what we realized was that, and we still know that, there is too little interaction between the different parts of the system. It's all about people, really. You need to build the connection first.
Definitely, and empathy, just to continue. I think that for a public officer, making a mistake is the biggest nightmare ever. And once you kind of get over the fact that mistakes aren't always bad, you actually learn from them, but you need to have the kind of risk space, or how would you call it, small enough so that there's no damage done. And we try to, in our mentoring program, we try to make that space, as I called it, like a safe place or haven to make mistakes or learn from by doing. Then you can actually grow the space eventually, because you understand that you need to learn, and that's how you grow the solutions, which are eventually much more effective and then have much more impact than the ones that you planned within your bubble. So I think that's just kind of the risk aspect has to be taken into consideration when you work with public officials.
And I think there is some resonance for me, Mark, in the characterization you gave of the kind of evolution of the experiment thing, because and the way that I've seen that across different case studies is the HLS approach starts to flourish in any given context when it moves from the first set of people doing an experiment, how do we change our practice, to then the next kind of ripple out, whereby how do other people's practice in the system need to change as a result of what we found, and particularly how does this need to be managed differently? How does my work need to be managed differently in order to enable this learning cycle to become the norm? And it's when it spreads out from that kind of first learning cycle to, okay, how does everything else need to be different to enable learning cycles to be how we do things around here? That's the kind of the key evolution where it starts to really embed and sustain and be that like learning as management strategy.
Yeah, and at least in my mind, I think that really ties to what Annalie and Paula just shared about the importance of relationships. I sort of have this image of, if you're going to be starting something in your pocket of the organization, very quickly you're going to realize how what you're doing is going to influence someone else, and how what they're doing is going to influence you. And our general concept of scale is, I'm going to take something in my pocket and just grow it, which violates complexity, which yeah.
Exactly. And kind of one of the things that I think was most important from what Annalie and Paula's work uncovered was, I think Paula was starting to say then, a change in the nature of what scaling means. Because the really, really genius thing that their work showed was that it is the capacity for innovation and learning itself which needs to be scaled. Don't try and take any of the innovations themselves to scale, because as you say, that violates the complexity thing. Because those innovations work because of their relationship to a particular context in a particular time. You can't take that out and implement that elsewhere and expect it to work. So what can be scaled, and this is the kind of interesting in terms of the role of national government, is what can be scaled is the capacity for learning and innovation itself. That is the thing that I think I learned most from kind of Paula and Almi's work.
That's really wonderful. And I think a great segue as we bring this part of the conversation to close. Again, flagging for everyone that John and I will stay on after the top of the hour to field any other questions. John's done quite a bit of work in this space. But before we do that, really big thank you to Toby, Annalee, and Paula, both for joining us today, but also for all of the work that you're doing to bring this work into the world. The public sector very much needs it, as do we all. So if for any of you who want to go deeper into human learning systems or to read about the work that Paula and Annalee were involved in, I've just put some links in the chat. And something I've never seen before is on page 3 of the Human Learning Systems report, you'll find links to all of the authors who have contributed to the report. So if, as you're digging in and reading through the report, you have questions, thoughts, or feedback, Toby said that it's all right to reach out directly to the authors with those questions, thoughts, and feedback. So you'll find those on page 3 of the report. So with that, if you'd like to leave us now, feel free. We hope to see you again at a Systems Innovation or Systems Innovation London Hub event in the near future. And if you'd like to stay on and ask any questions, we'll be around for another 10 or 15 minutes. Thanks so much again, Toby, Paula, and Annalee.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good week. See you later.
And with that, over to you, John. I know you've got a few questions in the hopper.
Yeah, John Black asked a question earlier about do any of the case studies have populations related to the evolution of policing? And from memory, none of the case studies directly are centered around policing. However, some of them, it naturally begin to embrace policing in the way that policing has to get involved with the complex issues that some people in a locality will experience. One of the things I personally have found working in policing is that the culture within policing can often be more challenging than local government. I'm trying to put it in particular words. It can be more challenging. So what I've personally found is that might not be the best place to start. The best place to start might be somewhere else, and to bring the elements of policing that are more open to this kind of work into that work rather than the other way around. I hope that's kind of helped to answer the question, John.
So, John, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. So first of all, that was very gentle. So thank you for that. I'm stuck in the quandary that I have a nonlinear approach that I've given to people, and I come out of 30 years in the military and 25 plus years in policing. And my doctoral business deals with systems complexity and wickedness and everything else. And I'm trying to explain a nonlinear concept to people that have been rewarded for their entire life linear type thinking and that. So I get that. The quandary I have right now, though, is we still have to have the conversations, because if we don't, I'm watching people grow their next generation by digging in the trenches and doing this type of thing. So first of all, I applaud all the stuff you guys are doing. I agree with it. And what I've done is I've started living simply in the discussion area of exposing them to the sense-making aspect. And very few people that have been at the chief level that have been caught unaware or that kind of stuff. They'll tell you, well, obviously my intelligence wasn't good or my sense-making wasn't good. And that provides us the bridge to say, well, maybe if you look at all the interactions, what you weren't understanding is the way everything interacts with everything else. And usually as I get higher, regardless of the country I deal with, they're beginning to grasp that. So I applaud the stuff you guys are doing, which is why I'm on here this morning. So thank you.
Okay.
Oh, John Mortimer, you're muted.
Sorry. If anyone has any more questions, it might be easier to unmute yourself like I didn't do and just ask the question at the moment with a few. There are less of us. One of the questions that was placed earlier was about this would, Dora said this would require that people appreciate people as equals. No better, no worse. And Vinish said that this is about teams rather than the individual. And I think that points to the people element of this, is that when you've got new public management, people are treated as cogs in a wheel of a machine type design. And what this is about is recognizing that we as staff and local authorities are human beings, and we come with our own differences, and it's that has to be focused on in terms of us as people, and people are the center of learning. We learn through people. We don't learn through procedures and mechanisms. So that was an answer to a couple of the questions there. Does anyone have anything else they want to say before I go on to one more question that someone asked? Okay. There was a question with regard to what happens when the senior manager is focused on digital design and digital development in the public sector. This is particularly strong in the UK, where we have a big trend at the moment for leaders to be seduced by digital. The reality is that if digital is just imposed on top of what's already there, the effectiveness of that digital does not absorb the complexity that's actually out there in the real world that public services work in. By combining human learning systems, complexity, and digital together, we will design different digital solutions than what we will have designed before. And in the UK, we are making significant progress, but also significant mistakes in the way that digital is being implemented across the board, where in many cases that doesn't recognize the complexity of the problems, doesn't recognize that a lot of this is to do with human beings, not data. And also digital is often implemented in a silo mentality rather than a systemic mentality. Does anybody have any experiences here with regard to that, or want to make any comments with regard to that?
Yeah, John, this is John Black for the rest of the group. We've run into the same problems. And what I usually offer to that is most of the time in a business-centric approach, digital is viewed as either requirement, an outcome, an answer. And what happens then is the digital approach is seen as the objective rather than as an enabler to engagement. And so what we have to do is, what I've done is we reframe the conversation in that the digital platform in its development has to recognize and be equally as good as an exploring platform, a learning platform, an engagement platform, whatever terms you want to give. In addition to answering, I can get data to you quicker, or I can see the Q1 charts or whatever else is going on, which is fine. but it can't only it will fail in a complex or wicked type of system if it doesn't address it will leave money on the table, so to speak, if it doesn't give you the engagement that it can. Because a lot of things are actually done very well, and they foster the back end engagement, which actually ends up being a greater value, even though it's intangible. So that's what we've done with some of the projects I've worked on.
There is a question. Sorry, someone was going to say something.
Yeah, John, maybe I'd just say, and is it a question of kind of the general approach and general strategy, like technology is a tool, right? It should be a tool for executing on an overall strategy. And when you turn that around and you think, technology is the solution, you get caught up in thinking technology is the way to do everything, and you forget about the strategy, you forget that it's there to take you somewhere, then I think that's where things go wrong when in organizations, but even generally and more generally in society with things like artificial intelligence and so forth, when we forget that technology is only a tool and start thinking it's kind of an end in itself. And if you can flip that around and really start from the strategy side of it, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go? And then the technology to support that. I think that's kind of the paradigm that will help you solve a lot of those problems. And when you flip that round and get it upside down, you run into a lot of complications. Just a general kind of comment there.
Yeah, really good comment, and sounds like you've had experiences that have, probably a lot of us have got experiences that have left psychological injuries from implementation of technology. But one point here that Dora has just raised is when the government follows divide and rule, how do we even start when public servants are not public servants? My goodness, that is actually a fundamental question, and for a lot of people in this work, a lot of the difficulty comes when you try and do something and the leadership doesn't want that to happen because they have a different mindset. And where Toby Lowe's research has come from is that has come from something called New Public Management. So one way of dealing with that is a lot of senior people will feel perhaps personally challenged if someone comes along with a new approach, with something that they haven't come across with. Some leaders will feel that they are that they should know this way of working. The reality is, in the UK at least, and some other countries, those leaders have been brought up on new public management. They see that it's been there for 20 odd years. And a lot of people think that that is the way that public services should work. So if you're able to blame the current way of thinking, not on individuals, but on something called new public management, it sometimes takes the blame elsewhere. And people can then go, oh, well, if that's what I've been following, maybe I will be more open to following a slightly different approach. But you do have a good point, Dora. If you do have government, which is about divide and rule, it's how do you start to change that mindset, which Toby and others mentioned earlier about that being a significant challenge. And also there was an answer about start off small and start off with people and managers who may be open to this and start with them in a small scale first as a small example is certainly one way to go.
Great. Any other questions or thoughts from the group that we can answer or field? And if not, then I think we will, I'll wait in case any of you are typing and elongate the outro. But thank you all for joining, for your questions, contributions, and John for co-hosting, and Joss for really bringing us all together. So we'll see you again, hopefully soon, and hope you enjoyed today's